There we go. All right. Thank you all very much for coming today. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to go ahead and give a brief introduction to the BEAD Corps for anyone who hasn't worked with us before or isn't familiar. We are the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Data Management Corps, and we provide research support services to faculty and trainees throughout Hopkins. Our research services range from epidemiological study design to really complex data management and analysis. We do REDCap database design and development, EPIC data extractions. We can help you work on projects involving JH Crown data, which is where the COVID patient data is stored here. And most recently, we have expertise also in patient-reported outcomes and microbiome research. Faculty and trainees in supported departments get 20 hours per fiscal year to work with us. And right now, those departments are Department of Medicine, Pediatrics, Gynecology and Obstetrics, and those with a primary office at Bayview. So to access these services, it's very easy. Please just send an email to beadcorps@jhmi.edu, and we will help you get connected to one of our leads to begin your project. So without further ado, let me introduce Sean Tackett. First of all, he is a clinician in general internal medicine, and he is our faculty lead specialist in medical education research. Sid Eaton is also here. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, and she is our faculty lead with expertise in patient-reported outcomes, which is a service line that's actually available to all faculty and trainees, not just in our supported departments. So let me go ahead and let them get started. Oh, let me say also, if you have questions at the end, feel free to either use the chat function or to unmute yourself and ask the question. They're happy either way. And let them go ahead and get started. Welcome again.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, we are happy either way. So we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So, if you want to put on your video, that's nice. It's always nice to see people's faces, especially if they're going to speak. And then you do speak up as opposed to, typing into the chat. In many ways, it actually makes it easier because if I'm screen sharing, I can't see the chat readily. So, and often if you're going to interrupt, it's going to be for good reason. So we just want to make sure that we include you guys. So just to start, so we sent you guys a survey. We know how many of you did it and received it. So just, kind of curious for anybody who took it, what you thought, what the experience was like from receiving the email to filling it out. Also curious, if you saw the email but didn't complete it, that's okay. But, also curious, to hear your thoughts on maybe why you looked at it but didn't quite get to it.
And if you'd like to type in the chat box too, that works great.
So I know that I did it, and then it was like unclear whether or not the submission actually went through. And I started to just do it again. And then I said, oh, I got to move on to other stuff. So I don't know if actually it happened or not.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and a common thing, right? So often, how many email surveys do you get or do you try to send to people? And, just don't have time, right? And it's particularly if you do it once, try to do it again, right? So I see something coming through in the chat. Let me look at it. Yeah, so Elizabeth saying, if I see something right away, I'm quick to fill things out, but once it gets buried in days worth of email, and it's gone, right? You're gonna forget about it. So yeah, I just wanted to prompt you guys to think about it. What we said was that it was a 2-minute or less survey. We sent it on Thursday. We said, please complete it by Monday, 2 minutes to over 5 days. And so here is what we got. So we sent it to 106 people. So we were very liberal in sending it out. As anybody who may have registered for today's session. And although would say that we have 53 people who are actually here right now, including the 3 hosts, and we got 27 responses. So generously, we could say 50% response rate. although I'm not even sure, who's here and who maybe who completed the survey but didn't make it here today. So that's one thing to say. And then kind of as you said, as both of you said, that we sent it out on February 11th, and we said, go ahead and take your time and give it to us on Monday, so we have time to look at it before Tuesday's presentation. And lo and behold, just about everybody did it right away. And then if it didn't get done right away, it probably wasn't getting done. And there were 2 people who kind of managed their time such that it was done, on the due date. So I think, I don't know, this is interesting. This is typical, right? So we didn't send any reminders. Usually you get your biggest bullets right away on an electronic survey, such as what we sent. And then just, oops. And if you guys, because I don't want to keep having to click the chat and like interrupting the flow. So if you guys want to just monitor the chat and bring in comments that come in,
Yep.
Just go ahead.
Yeah, we got one other comment, Sean, from Kristen saying, I must have assumed it was a reminder for this session and deleted it without opening. I think that's another likely common experience. We get so many emails that come through, and if you sign up for a course, you're thinking, oh, it might be the Zoom link so I can access it, not realizing that perhaps it's a survey.
There you go. And just to share with you guys kind of what you shared with us. So out of the 27 respondents, actually majority of them had created a survey before and participated in survey item development, collecting survey responses most commonly. And then a fair number of the respondents were familiar with PROS and identified challenges as being collecting appropriate surveys, creating new survey items is like a plurality, I guess, among the different challenges. So not totally unfamiliar with PROS either. And then you guys, we asked what, if you did a survey, what was the survey about? So these are just representative examples for you to think about kind of the range of reasons that one may send a survey. So the first one was a targeted needs assessment for POCUS is a point of care ultrasound curriculum, nutritional knowledge assessment, study sign up, or sort of administering a questionnaire through Qualtrics, measuring patient medication adherence, long-term follow-up of research participants. So these are all, common and good reasons to send surveys. So we also just wanted to also pause and think about, well, what are principles for sending out surveys? So I'll let Sid kind of take the lead here.
Yeah, so we just wanted to reflect a little bit before we dig into more of the nuts and bolts of our presentation for why it is, generally speaking, that you would want to use a survey for your research. So Sean, if you want to click through for the bullet points here, one of the main reasons is that you want to get self-report because it is the best instrument, best method for you to get information that otherwise would be very, very difficult to measure. So these are often attitudes, how people feel about a certain thing, personal experience, behaviors that you can't observe. So really things that without using a survey would be really, really difficult, if not impossible, to measure. The next part being that you have something called a construct of interest. So that's really the idea in your mind of what it is that you want to use your survey to measure, whether it is someone's perception of symptoms that they're experiencing, maybe their satisfaction with a course that they took, whatever it is that you want to use these items on your survey to assess. And to that point, you have a good idea of what questions you want to ask to get there. Surveys are great when you don't need flexibility. It's a standardized instrument that you're using. Everybody is going to be answering the same questions. And it's also a good method when you don't need a dialogue. So for example, if you really wanted to get into process type questions, a qualitative interview might be better suited to your question, whereas a survey is where you have a set number, set items that you want to ask, and you're okay asking them the same way for each person. Another reason to use surveys, you think that your group of interest will respond and that they can answer your questions. And then lastly, that you have the time as well as the wherewithal to either develop a survey if you don't have one and need to make a new one, or there might be one available already that's appropriate for your question, and you're able to implement it in your research or in your project.
Yeah, so we're just going to upfront kind of define education research and then like kind of what we mean by clinical research during the presentation. And so When I say education research, what I'm really thinking and talking about would be health professions education scholarship. So often this may not fall under the form of research, or sorry, the form of scholarship as discovery, which is sort of traditional research. But there is a scholarship of teaching, integration, and application. And so just to be aware that when we're thinking about education, often our concepts of what comprises scholarship can be a little more flexible and are often non-traditional. But in common subjects in survey-based health professions education scholarship would be like health professions learners. So we're thinking, often we think about medical students or residents or physicians, but nurses, any other health professions learner can be included. Educators themselves, like faculty, are often included in studies that are sort of in the field of health professions education scholarship. And I personally have a keen interest in regulators and what they do related to setting standards for assessment or setting standards for accreditation. And then, usually subjects are not going to be patients or the public in this field. And then common settings, just to kind of wrap your mind around it, would be, classroom-based setting, particularly for like preclinical kind of learning, clinical care settings. And those are the main areas where people will sort of be acting, where you're observing and trying to measure their behaviors. And then just some examples for uses of surveys and health professions education scholarship commonly. So we saw some of this already. Needs assessment, sort of monitoring learner behaviors and their activities, again, thinking about study habits or well-being, stuff they're going to do on their own time that you can't otherwise really know about. Knowledge assessments are common. So, you can administer like a multiple choice question exam through a survey software or on paper. Surveys are common use in program evaluation for monitoring distal learning outcomes. And we saw this as an example of somebody else looking at research participants and longitudinal monitoring. And then I think another use of surveys would be sort of the consensus development types of modalities like Delphi methodologies or other methodologies where you're trying to not necessarily measure how many over your sample, but trying to achieve consensus among a group of stakeholders who may be geographically dispersed. And then often you might think, well, what's really different about surveys in health professions education scholarship compared to others? And really nothing in a way, because validity is validity, research is research, and so the same rules are going to apply with any kind of measurement you try to do through a survey in health professions education scholarship as in any other domain. I think the key considerations that would be different would be that often the subjects that you're surveying are going to be within institutions, and so you kind of know who they are. You may already have a relationship with them, particularly if you're participating in the program. And so like there's often less emphasis on very fancy sampling strategies like they have in public health or market-based research or other types of research like that. And there's a greater emphasis on having a high response rate among all the people that you include. And then another thing that differentiates is that the learners themselves, being in a health professions education program, I mean, they tend to be higher than average literacy. And so that means that you usually don't need help administering the survey to the person. They can often self-administer, which is why these email surveys have become so popular. You can often, use more complex items like give the example of case-based multiple choice questions. That wouldn't hold up for the vast majority of the population, but for health professions education learners, it's actually very effective. And then if you provide an open-ended prompt, you often get sort of more free-flowing and verbose types of responses that may lend themselves to qualitative analysis. Whenever, again, typically qualitative analysis is not what you would want to do in survey-based research.
And then just to give a little overview on patient-reported outcomes and their use in clinical research. Clinical care and the use of patient-reported outcomes, it's really predicated on the idea of helping patients to feel better. And the use of patient-reported outcomes involves getting the patient's perspective, and that's viewed. The inclusion of the patient perspective is really viewed as valuable complementary information to more traditional clinical data like lab results, imaging, other types of data that you might be collecting. PROs enhance patient care and outcomes, and are really viewed as informative to policy as well as improvement in healthcare systems. So just some examples of this. The FDA has actually issued guidance on how to use patient-reported outcomes, best practices for using PROs to support labeling claims. NIH has the PROMISE program, which involved developing just a wide range of patient-reported outcome instruments that are freely available for use, for researchers to use. And over in the UK, the NHS has a quality improvement initiative, which involves giving pros as part of standard care. So when I talk about patient-reported outcomes, these are standardized and validated patient reports, so surveys of how they feel. So common areas that are measured are health-related quality of life, functional status, depression, pain, but there's lots of other domains that can be measured. These are surveys. They can be structured interviews. For individuals younger than 18, often we collect complementary caregiver proxy reports to see how a caregiver perceives their child to be functioning, in addition to the patient report. And these are instruments that are collected both in clinical care settings as well as outside of clinical care settings. So they can really be given in either domain. And they're different from qualitative research. So these are standard surveys. I have an example on the next slide that yield quantitative scores and can be analyzed using inferential statistics. And pro selection is really an involved process. So there are a lot of existing instruments out there that can be used in clinical research. The challenge is determining which one is going to be best for answering your research question, as well as what has evidence of good psychometric properties. There's a lot of things that need to be considered when using pros, but also a lot of resources that we'll be touching on in this presentation to help make that a little bit easier if you were wanting to use this in your research. And here I just have an example of a patient-reported outcome. So this is from the PROMISE measures available, like I said, freely through NIH. And this is the pain interference short form. So it's 4 items. It prompts the respondent to think about the past 7 days and answer each item using that 5-point Likert scale to the right, ranging from not at all to very much. So this is a pretty standard type of format for what a patient-reported outcome looks like. So I'll turn it over to Sean for the next slide.
Yep. So that was surveys why, what, and now we're on surveys how. And there are books, there are courses. You could probably maybe you can get a PhD in like how to do a survey. So we're going to try to just give you like the very basics in a framework to kind of hang some of your thinking on. So the first thing that is often considered in surveys is the population you want to sample. And I apologize, I'm having to like move my Zoom bar as I try to find this. And so again, what's the population that you're interested in? How can you access it? And what's your sampling frame? And how you optimize response rates? And we'll be going through each of these in turn in greater depth. Survey mode is just what that means is how is a survey going to be given? Again, I often think in terms of emails. Sid often thinks in terms of like questionnaires for patients, but there are many types of modes that could be used. Timing involves when the survey should be administered and how long people have to take it, and again follow-up reminders. Measurement is what a lot of people want to jump right to, sort of like writing the items and kind of what the instrument itself is going to look like, and so we'll get into that a bit. Ethics is something that should just kind of always be considered in life in general, but particularly in any research where you may be collecting confidential information and you need to protect it. And then data analysis and reporting is always good to think of upfront because there are some survey items that are easier to analyze than others, and so again planning for that is important. And again, we won't have time to get into the weeds with all of these. And so there are resources out there for pros. So some of them are listed here, and they'll also be on a slide at the end. And then there are others for education-specific research, medical education. So then the sample, like I said, we're just going to go one by one. So a lot of this is just probably rehash from stuff you already know, but maybe haven't thought of in a while. So what's the sample? So first, there's a population of interest that we're going to try to make inferences towards based on our survey sample population. And then within our sample, there's going to be respondents, and then there's going to be people who complete part of the survey but don't complete all of it. And so it's just important to consider these relationships as you're, again, thinking about how you're going to be able to answer your research question with a survey. And then there are 2 key factors. So there are a lot of people just want to tell you, wow, we got 1,000 people to respond to our survey. But 1,000 people is actually not very good if you send it out to like 100,000 people, right? Because you don't have a lot of representativeness. So you have power, but not representativeness. On the other hand, if we send it out to 15 people and we get a response rate of 14 out of 15, we probably don't have a lot of power to detect differences between groups if we wanted to make between groups comparisons. So really you need to think about both when you're thinking about your sample of just the overall number for power purposes, and then your ability to get a high response rate, and that's for representativeness or generalizability purposes. And then just, this is a fun fact. So the quality of education-based survey research, not great. So it's only, first of all, response rates are only reported in 63% of published survey research. So that's changing, but this is like most recent data. But if you do want to publish and you are going to report your response rate, you tend to need to get very high response rates. And so, so a majority is usually kind of the requisite number. And then optimizing response rates. So again, there aren't hard and fast rules for this, but there are basic principles. So number one, make it as easy as possible for people. We talked about already, like busyness, and it may not be their top priority, and they're probably looking at it as they're doing you a favor. And so, it needs to be easy. You need to be considerate about the burden you're putting on people. So not too long or challenging. You want to use a mode that's going to accommodate their preferences. Ideally, give them some time to do it. Maybe if it's fun, they'll be more inclined to do it. Incentives can help sometimes. So, offering some sort of monetary incentive can increase response rates sometimes. And then reminders also help to an extent, although there's diminishing returns kind of the more reminders you send. And then if you end up doing your best and you get your response rates and they're still not optimal, then you have options on the analytics side to think about comparing non-responders to responders, and so making an argument for how the respondents are comparable in many ways and representative of non-responders. And then there's some other references that go into this in deeper detail.
And then I just wanted to touch on, using surveys in clinical research when the paradigm is a little bit different. Participants have, formally enrolled in a study. There's likely incentives built in. It might be a longitudinal study, and so you're, trying to maximize your response rates. And there's not a lot of research that's done on best practices for doing this, but I did want to touch on a study from a group here at Hopkins on ways that we can enhance participant retention, which is a challenge in clinical research, including research with pros and survey-based research. So this was a study that looked at a national longitudinal cohort of people with acute respiratory distress syndrome, and they had follow-up assessments at 6 and 12 months post-baseline with excellent retention rates, and over 95% retention with fairly long surveys that were given via telephone. So 20 to 40 minute assessments, 242 questions, and they had a really nice standardized approach for contacting participants via phone and letters, and increasingly, emails being used as well. The study relied on phones and letters, but there might be concerns that if you take a more active approach to getting your data, that it might be viewed as bothersome by participants. And what this study found was that only 5 to 8% of participants were reporting being bothered more than a little bit by steady contact attempts. And in using this approach, they were able to get the data. People did complete the surveys, and they were able to retain participants in the study. So I did just want to highlight this as a concern that sometimes comes up when asking people to fill out surveys and repeatedly contacting to try to get these data. That if you use a planful approach and use best practices for reaching out to participants, that it can enhance your retention and does not necessarily need to be viewed as bothersome to participants, and can really increase the value of the data that you're collecting and the quality of your science as well. So moving on into surveys, mode of getting your data, there are, they really fall into non-digital versus digital approaches. So historically, surveys were just given via paper and pencil. So you just handed someone a survey, whether it was when you saw them when they came in for a clinic visit or for their research appointment, or if after a course that they took, and they filled it out right then and there. or the paper-based surveys were sent out by mail, and you ask them to mail that back to your research team. Another method is optical mark recognition. That's basically Scantrons, like ones that you probably did in grade school or college. But increasingly, we are able to use digital methods for collecting survey data. And I think that it's really helped to improve the quality of the data that we collect. As you can imagine, with paper-based methods, there opens up a lot of potential for errors to occur. For example, if you collect the paper version and then you have to enter it into your Excel sheet or wherever you're maintaining your database, and a lot of human errors can happen that way. So digital assisted involves things that likely many people here are familiar with. So REDCap being one, Qualtrics being another, that are both available to folks here at Hopkins. And then Excel and Access are programs that you're likely familiar with as well. Some of the nice advantages of using Qualtrics and REDCap, as well as something like SurveyMonkey, is that you can email out a link and get a response that way. And the survey responses can be exported in a nice Excel sheet. So they're a lot of the data management and cleaning aspects are kind of taken care of. Not completely, there's still some work to be done in getting your data ready for analysis, but it does really help to collect the data and maintain a higher degree of quality. There's also the possibility now to send surveys out via text message. So REDCap has this capability, as well as Qualtrics, which is another nice way to reach participants and respondents, especially since people are so much more oftentimes engaged with their phones versus logging into their email. And then social media is another way that can be used to collect surveys as well. But really the best method, all of them have their pros and cons. So the best method for distributing surveys really needs to be based on who are your respondents, what are their characteristics, what method is going to be easiest for them to complete, and best reduce the burden of doing the surveys. And then also what's going to be most feasible for both you and your staff. And then lastly, what's going to maximize the data quality. So those are really the three things that I think should be kept in mind when figuring out how you're going to distribute a survey. But we also asked our respondents from our survey on some of the software that they were familiar with. And it looks like most people were familiar with at least one of the digital methods, with REDCap being the most commonly used, followed by SurveyMonkey and then Qualtrics. So it looks like, at least among the people who responded to our surveys, that a fair amount have experience using some of these digital methods for distributing. All right.
Yeah, well, and I'll just say here, I mean, for those people who may have never heard of Qualtrics, if you're in the School of Medicine, it's a free resource for you for electronic surveys, and it's encouraged over instead of SurveyMonkey. Oops. So now timing of when and how long should you be giving surveys for it? So I frequently get the question like, how long should my survey be? How long is too long? And the answer is, shorter is generally better, because again, you want to reduce the burden on administering the survey itself. Although, of course, you can't make it so short that you can completely measure what you're trying to measure. So those are, and then in terms of like whether or not to give somebody an estimate of how long it will take them, it's just sort of from a social exchange and ethical standpoint, it's nice to give people a heads up about how long it may take. Although there have been some counterintuitive studies that have shown that if you don't once people are in the survey, if you don't tell them how much was left, that they'll complete more of it just because they think they're getting closer to the end. Seems kind of like a mercenary way to operate, but again, there's some evidence to go along with that. And then like when and where to survey, just that's general principles is how you're going to reach is where the sample is located and what will make it easy for them to respond. When to follow up, again, reminders can help. There's no set rule for like how often. You just kind of have to adjust based on the population you're thinking about and what your research questions are. And how long to keep data collection open. Again, you want to give everybody enough chance to respond, but you don't want time to bias like what's happening around you, to bias what's being measured. And then for longitudinal designs, they're often difficult to get. Well, they are often difficult, particularly with survey-based research, because in order to have in order to analyze them and utilize the longitudinal design, you have to have high response rates across the board, because every time you get, you know, a 50% and another 50%, another 50%, the chances of them all overlapping it becomes very, very small. So you have to be very thoughtful about how you do it. But if you can execute, then particularly by prospective enrollment, then that can help you. And then just for education specifically, recognizing that often like a pre-post design, people want to ask about, you know, in the beginning, how confident are you? And at the end, how confident are you? But there's going to be a lot of bias often, because they may become less confident after you expose them to kind of what they don't know. So just, it's a broad proposition often in education-based research. And I'll let Sid kind of tag on to sort of pro-specific points here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to a few points. So, you know, the first one about shorter generally being better, you know, it's always kind of viewed as good to give a shorter survey because it gets done faster, it's less burden on the staff. But, you know, especially in clinical research and using patient-reported outcomes, it's really important to look at the psychometrics for the instruments that you want to use, as well as the items, the content validity aspect. Sometimes there's short forms available, but when you actually look at the items that are being given versus, you know, the longer form, you might be missing out on some really valuable information that would answer your research question, or, you know, the reliability might not be as good as the longer version. So those are just really important things to think about, you know, besides just the respondent staff burden aspect. And it is really a balancing act, but really, really key things to keep in mind when designing your research study. For clinical research, the estimation of how long the surveys will take to complete, that is part of the informed consent process. So that is information that, you know, you do need to give an estimate to participants of how long you think it's going to take them to do the surveys. And then in terms of follow-up, I had added a point about considering a difficult to reach protocol. So this would be if you were doing some kind of a longitudinal study and had some follow-up time points and wanted to maximize, again, your retention in your study. This would just involve on the front end of planning your study, determining what your protocol is for reaching out to participants when they're due for an assessment. So how long before their due date will you start to contact? How long after will you accept responses? And how often are you going to reach out via phone, email, mail? And just laying out that standard protocol that you're using for each participant can help to maximize retention in your study and completion of your surveys and assessments, and do so in a standardized way. So we wanted to just go into some basic measurement principles of using surveys. So the first point being that, you know, and I kind of touched on this at the beginning, but surveys measure what we call constructs. And by constructs, this is the domain that you're interested in measuring with your survey. So it could be health-related quality of life. It could be knowledge after you've taken a course. And often you're looking at how different constructs from your surveys, whether it's, you know, items within the same survey or multiple surveys, how they relate to one another. It's really important when you're developing a survey or looking at how a survey was developed that constructs are well defined, and that there's a conceptual framework that helped to inform how the survey was designed. Oftentimes, you know, we're labeling these constructs. So we're using our language to label what it is that we're trying to measure. And language is not always consistently used. And so one survey might be called something that kind of sounds like what you want to measure, but maybe it's not exactly there. So it's really important to have a good understanding of what it is that the survey is measuring or what it is that you want to measure. When selecting existing instruments, it's really important to look at what the validation evidence is for those instruments and assess if they've gone through rigorous development. There are published guidelines out there to help with instrument selection. And again, we have those listed at the end of the slideshow. And there's also evidence-based guidelines for writing new items. And I think I'm going to hand this part off to Sean, right? I think you had some things to add here.
Yeah, just to say that, you know, so often in education, you're stuck without being able to use an existing scale or a standardized measure, because you can imagine each curriculum's different, each learners and their environments all vary a lot. So you often need to kind of customize what you're measuring and write your own items. And so just to, there are evidence-based guidelines for writing your items. There aren't hard and fast rules for writing them. And again, we won't have time to get into those in detail today, but there are resources that references that we provide you can look at that are very specific about sort of what to do and what not to do when writing items. Another thing to emphasize here, though, is that I say the state of the art is greater than science. Again, it'd be nice if there were rules that applied to every single scenario. They just aren't. And so often it is like a judgment call based on your own expertise as a researcher, based on how you know your learners. This is particularly true in, like, I'm really speaking toward educational scholarship. And again, one way to help you kind of overcome this need to rely on evidence would be just very simply thinking about surveys as highly structured conversations. You ask a question, you get an answer. You ask another question, you get an answer. And so, basically you just need to make sure that what you're saying is clear to the person you're saying it to, so that they can answer it and give it in an accurate way, given that there aren't opportunities for follow-up, as we discussed. And then validity. So validity. Validity means, is your measure accurate? So we say our survey is going to measure this construct. Does it? It's essentially, right? Is it true? And so there are different paradigms for thinking about validity. The one that aligns most closely often with surveys is sort of this MESICS or like a psychometric type of paradigm, and outlines 5 different evidence types. So one thing, just to make sure I say this to get it off my chest, don't say validated. Don't say, well, we used a validated survey or we validated our survey, because it's not a binary concept. It's you never actually reach the perfect instrument that's going to work across the board and give you perfect truth, right? It's asymptotic types of dynamics. And so you accrue validity evidence that what you're measuring is true and accurate. So different types of evidence would include content. And so examples that are commonly used when developing surveys would be, literature review involving stakeholders, identifying explicitly what your conceptual framework is. There's the response process type of evidence. And so this relates to, again, how making sure that respondents are answering the survey under similar conditions, like their process is similar. And it also relates to how the data is kept. Relation to other variables is exactly what it sounds like, where, if you're measuring your construct with your survey and you want to say that it's kind of valid measure, that you can show that it relates to other types of variables. So there's concurrent, there's divergent, and then there's sort of predictive validity. Internal structure. So if you guys ever heard of Cronbach's alpha, that's where this fits in, because that's looking at sort of how the structure of your instrument itself hangs together. And so if you're saying we have domains that we're measuring within this construct, there are statistical tests that can try to support that argument. And then consequences validity evidence is the type that's most, or least often, I guess, actually applied in practice. But the definition of it is that what are the consequences of just the process of taking the survey itself? So does the measurement process itself have consequences? So an example is, if you're asking somebody about highly sensitive information, like if you're asking somebody about trauma that they've had in their lives, that can trigger them and can give them a very negative emotional response. And so it's just a simple act of measurement can have important consequences. On the positive side of things, in education, if we're giving a knowledge assessment, we know we're applying testing effect. And so we know that we're probably just by the act of asking the questions, we're preparing them to enhance their knowledge.
So moving on into ethics of using surveys in research. Getting IRB approval applies to survey-based research as well.
I just wondered if I could pop in with a question about the trauma aspect of surveys.
Sure.
In terms of planning a survey that may be asking about issues that may cause an emotional response, how do you balance interest in letting people do it on their own and not have to be speaking to someone else about it versus doing it kind of over the phone or over Zoom or in person so that you have someone available if something does come up and the person needs immediate care?
Yeah, so that actually is going to be that's touched on the next slide. So it was great timing in the ethics of doing survey research, but I can get to that point first. So yeah, sometimes when you're doing surveys, especially asking patients about how they feel, trauma, depression, there might be information that you're receiving that is considered actionable. And so in those cases, this is one why it's really important to seek ethical review and have IRB approval. And two, as part of that, having a plan in place for how you will respond if someone endorses an item that is actionable, concerning a safety issue, how you will inform participants of, do they have to answer all questions? For clinical research, no, participants are free to not answer a question if they don't want to. They can take a break if they would like to as well. These are all things that are built into the informed consent process and in your protocol for how to respond to items that are potentially concerning. So that gets into the last point with actionable items. There's also a question about using survey information that you're collecting potentially for clinical care or for educational activities. And so those are other instances when it's really important to be very clear about how the information is being used. In an IRB approved study, that needs to be part of the consent process as well. Participants need to be informed about that too. And so really the goal is to have your study designed in such a way that if something were to occur, like the situation that you were describing, that you have a plan in place and that participants have been informed already about what will happen. So it's not really a surprise, and there's no guessing in how this is going to go and responding appropriately. Sean, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't know. I think that would have covered everything I would have thought of.
Any other questions that you had to the person who asked that question? That was a great question. Thank you. All right, well, let's see. I'll just touch on some of the other points on this, but I think we kind of covered a lot of them in responding to that excellent question. But yeah, I mean, I think the take-home messages are, seeking ethical approval is an important aspect of clinical research and in medical education research as well. Just being open about why you're giving the surveys, what it is that you're trying to accomplish by asking people to respond to them, and really plan ahead and have these protocols in place so that the benefits of your research outweigh the risks and the costs. And just being, respectful of the people who are in your study and who are responding to your surveys, not asking more information than you need, not asking more of their time, and really being careful to use the information that you're given appropriately, store it appropriately, manage that data appropriately. These are all really, really key parts of just doing research in general, but also when doing survey-based research. So we're going to get a little bit into just touch on some data analysis and reporting. So I just wanted to, again, highlight some of the resources for using patient-reported outcomes in research. Again, we'll have these listed at the end, but there's great resources out there for using PROs in reporting on your data from clinical trials, as well as analysis recommendations. So really excellent comprehensive resources that help guide you through that process of what you need to report and how it needs to be reported. So there's not really any guesswork in it because it's been really laid out so clearly.
Yeah, and similarly, there are checklists like in MedEd. Think about, did we do everything that we should have with our survey for the planning purposes, but also for reporting. And then the other points on this slide here are just, kind of as we mentioned earlier, is a good analysis starts by planning it before you even design and administer the survey. Having a good conceptual framework, making sure you have power. When you send the survey, identifiers are always preferred as opposed to a fully anonymous survey, which doesn't allow you to link to any other external source of data. And then just, as you're planning, just a useful exercise is often creating the shell table that you think will be in the paper, let's say, if that's what you're gearing towards, that will help you think about how the variables should be categorized or should be reported in an understandable way. And then after you have the data, up front, but also after you have the data, there are internal reliability statistics that you can use, kind of as we alluded to with validity. And Chromebox Alpha looks at internal consistency, and confirmatory factor analysis would look at, are there actually different factors that comprise the construct that we're trying to measure overall. And just there are other issues. Yeah.
Ask a question. This is Jay.
Yeah.
You mentioned psychometrics earlier in the talk, and I wondered whether there would be a little more about it. And so we said that it mattered what the psychometrics were to say whether the survey was too long, too short. Are there any guidelines? Is there a checklist, or is that a whole different area of research to actually do psychometric analysis of a survey in the planning stages?
Well, I don't know if I have a simple answer, but the answer I'd probably want to give you would be that these are your boxes to check when you're thinking about, did I measure my psychometric construct of interest?
Yeah, and I would say it's a step-by-step process, and it's not just one study that you would do. Often it's multiple parts where you're trying to establish content validity first using more qualitative methods often. And then when you move into the construct validity aspect, just distributing your survey to a large sample, and then using, your statistical methods to look at validity and reliability. But it's an ongoing process. And I agree with Sean that those are really the boxes you want to check. But
at what point would we do a little bit of analysis? Is the survey pretty? Is it convenient? Do people get bored doing it? Is that also one of the meanings of psychometrics? I do not know the exact meanings of words. Please correct me as needed. But those would be sort of important things, right?
Yeah, and I would probably place the examples you just gave into the response process category of validity evidence. So yeah, you can catch that during a pilot phase, but you can also catch it during the respondent phase. There's some of the things you're capturing are maybe difficult to get because I'm picturing like watching somebody take the survey and like a think out loud type of strategy, which would be kind of resource intensive. But there may be simpler ways to get it, maybe through a couple items on a survey to ask about the experience of taking the survey itself.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Yeah, and then these are some of the statistical measures that you also kind of have to choose from. So then we'll kind of let.
Yeah, so we just wanted to touch on missing data. That's a huge topic. We could spend a lot of time talking about missing data, but it is an inherent part of doing survey research. Just one of those things that likely will happen. Someone might miss a question or might not respond to your email blast of surveys, but you want to try to reduce it as much as possible because just like in other research, it's impactful when you get to your analysis phase. And so there's methods you can try to use to enhance completion of the surveys, reduce people missing items. Doing electronic survey administration can help with this. Interview-based administration can help as well. But it is something that you want to try to reduce as much as possible. And if there are any patterns that are emerging in why people are missing items or missing surveys altogether, something to be aware of as you go through your study and implement procedures to try to remedy that as soon as you can, just to enhance your data quality when you're done with your study. In terms of scoring and interpretation of scores, when using surveys and especially patient-reported outcomes, it's really key to understand how to score your measure. It sounds very straightforward, but oftentimes higher scores on one survey might mean good functioning. On another instrument, it might mean poor functioning. So it's really important just to know what the scores mean, how you're scoring them. going back to missing data, how much of the survey needs to be completed for you to score the survey. So these are all questions that you should have answers to by the time you get to your data analysis phase. Existing instruments often have instructions for how to score them, but not always. And so these, just things to keep in mind as you move towards that data analysis part of your study. Analyzing open-ended responses can get tricky. I prefer to limit use of open-ended responses if I can, because I find it to be very challenging to analyze that information. And I know Sean has some thoughts on this one as well that I'd like him to share too. But open-ended responses get tricky. So
yeah. So in prose, they're like a no-no. In education, they're a sine qua non. But like they're, so if you can imagine if you're evaluating a program, you want to say like, was this useful? Did it work or whatever? You're not going to anticipate everything that somebody's going to tell you. So it's always good it's best practice in educational settings to think about, just giving respondents a chance to say whatever it is that they wanted to say. Then you get a chance to baseline your items. And so that's just one tip, I guess. But second tip is that don't confuse surveys with qualitative research, because they're not. You can do analysis of words that were included in a survey, and you can use certain qualitative analytic methods to analyze those words, but it doesn't really fit the qualitative research paradigm. And so you can, so I'm trying to be very careful with how I'm using my language here, but I'll leave it there. And just the final pearl, because a lot of people end up like collecting a bunch of data and then just like forgetting about it, and it sits there for 5 years and then becomes irrelevant. And so like, just don't forget that it was hard work and you made it that far. So you might as well like see what you can do with the data, interpret it and apply it to improve things. So I think that's what we had to say.
Yep. So yeah, just some final thoughts. So, surveys they're an efficient way to get information, and a standardized way to get a lot of information from your sample. But we have touched on some of their challenges. Hopefully we've also highlighted and have on our final slide lots of resources that can help guide on how to use them appropriately. I think the biggest take-home message is to plan as much as you can if you're going to be using surveys in a study, to come up with contingencies for how you're going to implement them, how you will respond if needed. For example, if an actionable item arises, think about how you're going to be analyzing your data. And then, of course, we here at the BEAD Corps provide consultation on using these instruments in your work too. So please reach out if interested. Sean, any final thoughts you wanted to add?
No, I think that's it. So I know we've got about 5 minutes left for questions, and I was just looking through the chat here to see. So I think Mia asked one that frankly, I'm just not going to be able to answer with any expertise about. It says, when you have a survey that is not anonymous in Qualtrics, it tracks IP location data. Is this an issue? And an issue for what exactly? I think the question kind of derives from like, is it an issue about confidentiality or ethics, because you may be able to identify somebody? I think so. The IP address, I think maybe hypothetically you could track to an individual's computer, but I think there'd be so many hoops to jump through just to make that happen that it just wouldn't be practical. Most people wouldn't go to those links. IRB has no problem with like anonymous surveys that whenever IP or location is included. But I don't know, Sid, did you know more about that than I do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I agree with Sean's response. And then also if you're using Qualtrics that's supported through Johns Hopkins as well as REDCap, those are methods of distributing your surveys that are, the IRB will approve, it likes to approve those types of, they're viewed as safer ways to distribute your survey as opposed to giving it out through SurveyMonkey. So it has not been an issue that I have run into before. I'm sure that there are situations where perhaps you would need to address that, but generally speaking, that has not been an issue that I've run into in using surveys in my own research. I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and Amelia, thanks for offering, because it says that Amelia's saying, I think you can make Qualtrics anonymize surveys completely so that they're even without IP address. Yeah, so if it is a critical issue for your project, then to explore ways to work around it. So for Risa's asking, and sorry if I'm jumping the gun. If you want to turn your video on and speak, I'll let you. But I figured because it's in the chat, I'm just gonna run through it. For knowledge assessments, is there a different set of guidelines on how to score and assess responses? And for knowledge assessments, yeah, there's a field related to assessment of knowledge, and particularly when we're thinking about like case-based multiple choice questions, there's like an item analysis theory that you can apply to look at the effectiveness of your items. You can look at the effectiveness of your distractors, if you want, Risa, you can email me and I'll send you like references that can give you more information. But it's slightly different than what we talked about, although it's still fit within that psychometric validity paradigm that we described already.
Thank you.
Hi, I had a quick question. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Cool. My name is Maneem Dean. I'm a consultant epidemiologist working mainly with tribal clients. So I hope you don't mind my jumping the party here at a Hopkins institution. My question was regarding open-ended items, which I think you touched on earlier. We find that in many of the surveys that I work do for my clients, the people who do respond to the open-ended questions have a lot to say, but that's a very small minority of the total sample. Do you have any tips or any insight as far as addressing what percentage or what part of the sample provided answers to the open-ended questions versus the others? Like, is it fair to just say, well, if they didn't answer, they didn't have anything to say, or is there a little bit more nuance? Thank you.
I think it's one of the tricks. It's one of the pitfalls, I guess, of qualitative analysis in survey-based research. So, validity evidence in certain qualitative research comes from achieving thematic saturation. So the actual numbers that you include don't matter. It's just that you get all the ideas out there that kind of exist. In most, there are other ways to think about it, but that's one that commonly applies to surveys. And so I think that, to your point there, if you survey 100 people and you got 50 people giving you comments, is 50 people enough? And the answer is, I don't know. Like, you have to read the comments and say, like, well, is everybody just repeating the same thing over and over again versus, new ideas, all 50 people were saying entirely different things. And we need to just keep asking people because we haven't figured out all the ideas that could be out there. So it's one of the pitfalls, because normally if you're doing qualitative research per se, right, you have a chance to ask questions and to recruit new people and ask more questions there and accrue themes and so on. So yeah, so that's my answer. Is that what you're looking for?
No, that helps. Thank you.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This was, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm calling from my hospital clinic and I don't have camera, so apologize for not saying my face. But my question is, we do like a national survey where you post the survey link, public link in National Society, and we get responses, and our goal to have a representation of certain groups within the society, like social worker, nurses, physician, surgeon. My question is, how do you handle, because we don't know the response rate in this case, because we don't have the denominator really, but we have the representation rate. How you handle this in terms like, when you're writing a manuscript, we try to publish it, how you handle this issue?
Yeah, if you don't, you just have to, I guess, say what you did.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think
if you don't have a denominator.
Of doing anonymous surveys and not knowing how many people were able to view the link.
Okay, got it. And because I got a hard time that then you may have selection bias. So the people who responded to the survey, those who are really interested. So I think it's a weakness.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and then again, if it's available to you, if you can look at, I don't know what your population you're thinking about. I don't know. Let's say you're looking for national data, right? If you can look at a descriptive data for the national population and then compare that to the people who responded, so that non-responder to responder comparison, that can, again, you can sometimes use that to argue for generalizability.
Got it. Thank you so much. Just for future collaboration, how we can get hold of you guys, like how we can connect with you if we are interested in, collaborating with the BEAD team and designing survey and particularly like, national surveys?
Yeah, email us. So there's an email here. I don't know if you can see it, but it'll also be in the slides that'll be available after today. But beadcore@jhmi.edu. And then so that's the first step.
Sounds good.
All right, well, I think it's about time. I think there are still some more questions. We could continue with our discussion, but maybe I could ask anyone who has outstanding questions to email BeadCore, and I can connect you with Sean and Sid and hopefully answer any questions, and also provide a copy of the slides to anyone who wants it. And we have also recorded today. If you'd like to get a recording, just email beadcore@jhmi.edu. Thank you so much, Sean and Sid. That was really interesting. We really, really appreciate all the time that you spent on that. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Sid. And thanks everybody else for participating. It's always nice to kind of get voices in there and have some dialogue. So appreciate your engagement.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.